You don't have money for a cab anyway. Walk home like you always did.
Zora said, pen still in hand, ink barely dry on the divorce papers. Walk home like you always did. She smiled. She thought she had won. But Khalil Brooks didn't answer. He picked up his father's old leather folder, the one she had never once asked about in 12 years of marriage, and he walked out the courthouse doors without a word. That was when she saw it. A black Maybach already waiting, his uncle stepping out holding the door. The quiet certainty of a man who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Zora had just divorced a construction foreman. She had no idea she had also just triggered a family trust that had been building for 15 years, one that she had spent months trying to steal and never once understood. If you've ever underestimated someone who stayed quiet, stay with me and subscribe, because this one turns all the way around. To understand what Zora Brooks thought she was walking away from you, have to understand what Khalil Brooks had always been, not what he owned, not what his family name carried, but what kind of man he was before any of that became relevant. He was the kind of man who showed up first and left last. The kind who remembered which of his workers had a sick kid at home and quietly rearranged the schedule without announcing why. The kind who had been driving the same truck for 9 years, not because he could not afford another one, but because the truck worked, and he had never been someone who replaced things that still worked. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, unhurried in the manner of men who have learned that patience is not the same thing as weakness, and he had spent 12 years being married to a woman who had slowly decided that all of those qualities were liabilities. He had loved her the way he did everything completely and without ceremony. In the first years that had been enough. But as Zora's world expanded, as she moved deeper into the circles of Chicago's professional class, as the galas and the luncheons and the charity boards began to shape her sense of who she was and who she deserved to be, she started to see Khalil through different eyes. Not the eyes of the woman who had married him, but the eyes of the room she was trying to impress. And through those eyes, her husband became a problem. His work clothes, his calloused hands, his silence at parties where other men spoke loudly about things they barely understood. The truck, the early mornings, the fact that when people asked what her husband did, she had to say construction. Every morning for 12 years, before he left for a job site, Khalil picked up a worn leather folder from the top of his dresser and tucked it under his arm. It was his father's dark brown and soft at the corners, from years of handling, and it went with him everywhere, the way other men carried phones or coffee cups. Zora had seen him pick it up 10,000 times and had never once asked what was in it. She had long ago decided it was the kind of thing men like Khalil carried for the feeling of carrying something important, and she had moved on without further inquiry. That assumption, more than anything else, was the crack through which everything she thought she had built would eventually fall. The folder contained the original documents of the Brooks family trust, established 15 years earlier by Khalil's father, in the deliberate way that careful men establish things quietly, thoroughly, and with a clear understanding of what the future might require. The trust protected the family's assets, the commercial properties in Bronzeville, the construction company, the investment accounts, the community endowment. It also contained a clause his father had included with the prescience of a man who understood that money attracted a certain kind of attention. If there was ever a divorce, full control of the trust transferred to Khalil immediately and irrevocably. Any spouse found to have acted in bad faith against the trust would be barred from any claim on its assets entirely. His father had never said this clause was aimed at anyone. He had simply built the thing the way he built everything else, to last and to hold. Khalil had known about Layla Harper for as long as he could remember. She had been a presence in his family's life since before he could put a name to what she did. A woman who moved through the Bronzeville community with the competence of someone who had chosen her work not for recognition, but because the work needed doing. She ran the coordination office for a community development fund that had quietly partnered with the Brooks family for years, channeling resources toward affordable housing, youth programs, workforce training. She was sharp and direct, and had a way of cutting through the noise of any room she entered without raising her voice. Zora knew her name. She had been hearing it for years in connection with projects that involved her husband's family. She had decided early on that Layla was simply one of those women who orbited powerful men under the cover of non-profit work, and she had never looked closer than that. She should have looked closer. It was Layla, in fact, who first noticed what Zora had begun doing, though she said nothing about it for a long while. Zora had started attaching her name to things she had not built. A fundraiser for Bronzeville youth housing that the Brooks family had seeded and Layla's office had organized suddenly featured Zora's face on the promotional materials as a lead sponsor. A donation acknowledged in the community newsletter was attributed to Zora and Victor Langford as a couple, though the money had come from an account that had nothing to do with either of them. Small things, each one individually explainable. Together, they formed a pattern that Layla recognized and quietly began to document the way a person documents something they hope they are wrong about. Victor Langford had appeared in their lives the previous year, positioned at the edge of a professional circle that occasionally intersected with the Brooks family's construction business. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a garment, something expensive and carefully chosen, and he had cultivated the appearance of success so precisely that most people in the room never thought to look for what was underneath it. He had worked briefly on the periphery of a Brooks development project long enough to understand that the family had significant reach in the city's real estate and construction sectors, and not long enough to understand how carefully that reach was protected. He had seen an opening and he had taken it, and the opening's name was Zora. What Victor did not know, and what no one told him, because there was no reason to, was that Chu Reggie Brooks had a long memory and very little patience for men who approached his family sideways. Within weeks of Victor's first conversation with Zora, Reggie had made a phone call to every significant contractor and developer in a 50-mile radius who owed the Brooks family a favor. It was not dramatic. No threats were made. Victor simply found over the following months that doors he had expected to open were somehow not opening. He attributed it to bad luck, then to timing, then to a string of coincidences he could not quite connect. He did not connect them because it did not occur to him that a construction foreman's family would be capable of connecting them for him. Khalil knew about Zora and Victor by the 4th month of the affair. He had not been told. He had simply paid attention the way he paid attention to everything steadily and without announcement, and the pattern had made itself clear. He brought what he knew to Chu Reggie on a Tuesday evening in the old man's kitchen, and the two of them sat for a long time over coffee before either of them spoke. What they decided by the end of that conversation was not what most people would have decided. They decided to wait. The reason for waiting was not passivity, and it was not fear, and it was not denial. It was strategy arrived at through careful consultation with the family's lawyers. If Khalil filed for divorce first, Zora's legal team would argue that he had acted in haste to conceal assets, and the trust itself could be challenged in discovery. It would be expensive and protracted and ugly in ways that served no one except the lawyers. But if Zora filed, her own behavior became the evidence. Every attempt to access the trust's digital portal, every document she had tried to modify, every forged signature she had pressed onto paperwork that did not belong to her. All of it would become part of the record she had built against herself in the mistaken belief that no one was watching. So Khalil went home. He went to work. He carried the leather folder. He said good morning to his wife and asked about her day, and sat across from her at dinner, and felt underneath all of it the specific sorrow of a man who already knows the ending, but must wait for the story to arrive there on its own. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, not because he was weak, but because he was not, and there is a cost to maintaining your composure when everything in you wants to say, I know. I have known for a long time, and I am still here, not because I don't see it, but because I refuse to become someone I would not recognize just because you chose to. 8 months before the divorce was finalized, Nia Brooks came to see her brother at the job site on a Thursday morning. She sat in the cab of his truck with her hands around a paper cup of coffee, and she told him what she had heard. Zora had been on the phone with Victor in the back office of a restaurant where Nia happened to be meeting a contractor for an unrelated project. Nia had heard her voice through a thin wall, clear and unguarded, the way people speak when they believe no one who matters is listening. She had said things about the Brooks family that Nia would not repeat without the recording to back them up, because she wanted her brother to hear the actual words and not her version of them. She had already pressed record before she fully decided, to the instinct arriving ahead of the reasoning. "I have it," Nia said, holding up her phone. She did not play it. She just held it. "What do you want to do with it?" Khalil looked at the job site through the windshield for a long time. A crew of 4 was pouring a foundation 200 yards away, doing the work that had always been the work, unheroic and essential and lasting. "Hold on to it," he said finally. "We'll know when the time is right." Nia nodded. She put the phone away. She finished her coffee, and they talked about something else, and neither of them mentioned it again for 8 months. The morning of the divorce, Khalil woke before 5, dressed in the same deliberate quiet he brought to every early morning, and picked up his father's folder from the dresser. He held it for a moment before he tucked it under his arm, the way he had held it on the morning his father gave it to him, on the last good day before his father got sick, sitting in this same office on this same chair, telling him, "The point of building something is not to have it. The point is to make sure it outlasts you." He had not fully understood it then. He thought he understood it now. At the courthouse, Zora was already there when he arrived, sitting at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, wearing something new and carefully chosen. She looked like a woman at the beginning of something, rather than the end, which was, Khalil supposed, exactly how she saw it. He sat across from her, and he said nothing, and she did not say anything to him until the papers were signed and the judge had spoken and it was done. Then she leaned across the table with the pen still in her hand, and she said what she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. He looked at her for one long moment. He thought about 12 years. He thought about the hospital bills and the house and the early mornings and the old leather case sitting on the table beside him, which she had never once asked about. He picked it up, he stood. He walked out of the courtroom without answering her, because there are things that do not need an answer. And there are people who have already told you everything you need to know about them, and the only response left is to walk through the door they have opened and not look back. The Maybach was exactly where Reggie had said it would be. His uncle was already standing beside it, one hand resting on the open door, and when he saw Khalil come through the courthouse entrance, he simply nodded the nod of a man who had been waiting for something a long time and was relieved it had finally arrived. Behind him on the courthouse steps, Zora stood very still. She was looking at the car. She was looking at the man holding the door. She was looking at her husband, former husband now, by the ink of her own pen, walking towards something she had never once thought to ask about. Her expression had changed in a way she probably did not realize was visible, the smile gone, the confidence gone, something that looked almost like understanding beginning to take its place. But understanding arrived too late to be useful. It usually did. The inside of the Maybach smelled like old leather, and the quiet that belongs to men who have spent their lives making decisions other people only learn about afterward. Reggie settled into the seat beside Khalil and did not speak immediately, because Reggie Brooks had not gotten to where he was by filling silences that did not need filling. He let the car pull away from the courthouse, let the building slide out of the window, let a full block pass, before he opened his own folio on his knee and set it flat between them without fanfare. "It activated the moment the judge signed," Reggie said. "Everything transfers as of this morning. The Bronzeville properties, the company accounts, the community endowment. All of it." "I know," Khalil said. "The lawyers filed the initial documentation before you walked into that courtroom. By the time she figures out what she gave up when she signed those papers, there will be nothing left for her attorneys to argue about." Reggie glanced at his nephew. "Your father was a careful man." "He was," Khalil said. He was looking out the window at the city moving past, at the streets he had driven for 12 years, on the way to job sites, at the buildings going up, and the ones coming down, and the ones in between, that needed someone to decide what they were going to become. He did not look like a man who had just won something. He looked like a man who had set down a very heavy thing and was still feeling the absence of the weight. Reggie studied him for a moment, with the attention of a man who had known this boy since he was small enough to sit on a job site cooler and watch men pour concrete. "How are you?" "I'll let you know," Khalil said. It was not evasion. It was honesty, and Reggie recognized the difference. The trust his father had established was not complicated in its intention, though it was meticulous in its construction. Aldous Brooks had spent 20 years building a company that people in the industry respected and competitors occasionally feared, not because he was aggressive, but because he was thorough. He had poured that same thoroughness into the trust document, sitting with lawyers for months to close every gap, address every contingency, anticipate every version of the future that might arrive uninvited. The clause about divorce was not pessimism. It was the same principle that governed every structure he had ever built. You do not plan for the weather you hope for. You plan for the weather that comes. What neither Aldous nor Khalil had anticipated fully was how precisely Zora would walk into every provision as though she had been given a map to follow. The Trust's digital access portal had logged 7 separate failed login attempts from a device registered to Zora's name over the previous 14 months, each one arriving at a time when Khalil would have been at a job site and she would have believed herself unobserved. The attempts had been escalating in their sophistication, moving from simple credential guessing to what the Trust's security administrator described in his dry technical language as a structured effort to circumvent two-factor authentication. She had not succeeded, but the attempts themselves had been logged with timestamps and IP addresses, and the kind of documentary precision that made a lawyer's work very straightforward. The forged signatures were discovered by Nia, and the story of how she found them was one that Khalil had not heard in full until 2 months before the divorce, when his sister had come to his office on a Saturday morning with a folder of her own, thinner than their father's, but just as deliberate, and set it on the desk between them. Nia Brooks was 5 years younger than her brother, and shared his quality of stillness, though in her it expressed itself differently, as a kind of watchfulness that people sometimes mistook for reserve. She had worked for the family's community foundation since finishing graduate school, managing grant distributions and program assessments with the systematic precision she had inherited from their father. She had liked Zora once, or tried to, in the way you try to like the person your brother loves, extending goodwill you haven't quite earned the right to feel yet. The goodwill had lasted longer than it should have, because Nia was fair-minded, and because she understood that marriages were private countries with their own terrain, and it was not her place to draw conclusions from the portions of the map she could see. But the documents had been harder to set aside. Nia had been reviewing a grant application that listed Khalil as a co-signatory when she noticed that the signature block did not look right. It was close. It was very close, and if she had not grown up watching her brother sign his name at the bottom of subcontracts and work orders and birthday cards and school permission slips, since she was 10 years old, she might have accepted it. Instead, she had pulled 3 other documents from the filing system. Documents she knew Khalil had signed, and laid them side by side, and the difference was visible in the way a practiced forgery is always visible to someone who knew the original. Too even. Too controlled. The real signature had a slight leftward break in the second stroke of the K, a small flaw she would have recognized anywhere, and the forged one did not. How many, Khalil had asked, looking at the documents she had spread across his desk. 3 confirmed, Nia had said. Possibly a 4th, but the copy quality is too low to be certain. She had looked at him steadily. These are all attached to requests that would have authorized the movement of funds out of the community endowment accounts. None of them went through because the bank's authorization protocols caught the discrepancy in the signature. But they would have if the signatures had been better. Khalil had said nothing for a long time. He had picked up one of the documents and held it, looking at the signature block, at the name that was his name written in a hand that was not his. He had thought about all the mornings he had left for work while Zora was still asleep, about the trust documents in the old case on the dresser, about the 10,000 small choices that make up a marriage, and what it meant that someone had been sitting inside his studying his name carefully enough to try to replicate it. She was trying to take the community money, he said. He said it not as a question, but as a statement of the shape of a thing he was still in the process of understanding. She was trying, Nia said. She didn't get it. He had nodded. He had asked Nia to add the documents to the file she was keeping, the file that now also contained the recording from the restaurant, the portal access logs, the community event records, where Zora's name had appeared in place of the family's, the whole quiet accumulation of evidence that had assembled itself around him while he went to work every morning and came home every evening and said good morning to a woman who was simultaneously trying to steal from him and the community he had spent his life serving. That night, the night after the divorce, was the one Khalil allowed himself. He drove to his father's office, the original one in Bronzeville, that Aldous Brooks had operated out of for 30 years, before the company moved to a larger space, and which Khalil had kept intact after his father died, not as a shrine but as a working room, a place to go when he needed to think in a space that still held the shape of careful thought. He sat at the old desk with his father's folder open in front of him, and the overhead light on, and the street outside quiet, in the way Chicago streets got quiet after midnight, not empty, but gathered the city breathing rather than speaking. He did not cry. He was not certain sitting there whether the absence of tears was strength or simply exhaustion, or the numbness that descends on a person when the thing they have been bracing for a long time finally arrives and turns out to be exactly what they expected it to be. What he felt most precisely was the weight of 12 years laid out in front of him, like a set of plans for a building he would never finish. The hospital bills. The house he had renovated room by room across 2 summers, learning drywalling and tile work in the evenings, because he had wanted to do it himself with his own hands. Not because he could not afford to hire someone, but because he believed there was something a man owed to the place where his family would live. The early mornings, the conversations he had not had because he was at a site before she woke. The conversations he had tried to have that she had turned into arguments he did not understand and did not know how to end. He had loved her honestly. That was the part that was hardest to look at directly, not the betrayal, not the forgery, not even the cold calculation of what she had tried to take. The hardest part was the honesty of his own feeling, the knowledge that he had given what he actually had to give, and it had not been enough, or it had been the wrong thing, or she had wanted something that was never going to exist between them, and had spent 12 years trying to manufacture it from the materials at hand. He did not know which of those was true, and he suspected it did not matter. What mattered was that it was done, and that he was the one who had to decide, sitting in his father's chair, with his father's folder open in front of him, what kind of man he was going to be on the other side of it. He had enough. That was not a boast, and it was not comfort. It was a statement of fact and also a question, because having enough was not the same as knowing what to do with it. He had enough to take Zora apart, in the way that powerful men sometimes took things apart, when they had been wronged publicly, methodically, leaving nothing standing that had once been standing. The forgeries alone were a criminal matter. The portal access attempts were documented. The community fund misrepresentations had been witnessed. He could hand all of it to a prosecutor and to a publicist on the same morning, and by the following week, there would be nothing left of the person she had spent years constructing. He sat with that for a long time. He sat with the specific ugliness of it, the way vengeance dressed itself up as justice, and the difficulty of telling them apart when you were the one who had been wronged. He thought about what his father had told him once, not in relation to any particular person or situation, just as one of those things careful men said to their sons, in the hope that the son would remember it at the right moment. You can spend what you have on a man who wronged you, or you can spend it on something that outlasts both of you. You cannot do both. Choose carefully, because you only get to spend it once. He closed the folder. He sat for another while in the quiet. Then he made the decision that would define everything that came after it. Not dramatically, not with the ceremony such decisions sometimes received in the telling, but in the simple way that real decisions are made by a person alone in a room, at the end of a long day, choosing one direction over another, and meaning it. He would give the forgery and the portal fraud to the lawyers, and let the law do the part the law was built to do. The family's attorneys were already building the case, and Zora would face those consequences on their own schedule and through the proper channels. That was not a small thing, and he did not pretend it was. But the rest of it, the public destruction, the social reckoning, the particular pleasure of watching someone who had wronged you understand the full cost of having done so, he was going to spend that differently. He was going to spend it on the thing his father had built, and the community that had built his family, and the young people in Bronzeville who deserved something to walk toward. He was going to let the work be the answer, because the work lasted, and a man's anger, however justified, did not. He stood, straightened, the chair turned off the light. He took the leather folder with him. He locked the office door and walked to his truck in the empty parking lot and drove home through the quiet city, and by the time he arrived, he had already, in the way that matters most, moved on. Victor Langford discovered what had happened to his Chicago ambitions, the way most men discover the consequences of their miscalculations, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation of small closed doors that eventually added up to a wall. A development partnership he had been courting for months informed him, with the politeness of people who do not owe you an explanation, that they were moving in a different direction. A financing contact he had relied on for 3 years became suddenly and inexplicably unavailable. A city contract he had been positioned to bid on was awarded to a firm he had not considered a competitor. None of these things taken individually required explanation. Together, they described something that Victor, who was intelligent in the specific way of men, whose intelligence had never been tested by genuine consequence, eventually understood, was not coincidence. He did not understand who had done it, not precisely because the Brooks family had not made any calls that could be traced back to them in a way that would survive scrutiny. What Reggie Brooks had done was the business equivalent of what Khalil had done in the courtroom, which was to act before the other person understood the game had started. He had made suggestions to people who respected his judgment, offered information where it was relevant, and let the industry's ordinary mechanisms of trust and reputation do the rest. It was not dramatic. It was effective in the way that quiet, well-placed pressure is always effective, which is completely and without the noise that allows people to organize a defense. Victor had not loved Zora. That was the part she took longest to arrive at, perhaps because arriving at it required admitting that everything she had built her decision on had been from the beginning constructed on false ground. He had wanted what she represented, which was proximity to a family whose standing in the city's construction and real estate world was more substantial than he had initially understood, and he had been willing to maintain the performance of affection for as long as the proximity remained useful. When it became clear that the proximity was not going to produce what he had expected, the performance became expensive in a way he was not willing to sustain, and he began to withdraw the way a tide withdraws gradually and then all at once. Zora had not seen it coming, which was perhaps the detail she found hardest to sit with afterward, because she had always believed herself to be the person in any room who understood the room. She had been so certain of her own clarity, so convinced that she was the one making deliberate choices, while other people simply reacted, that she had not noticed the shift in Victor until it was already complete. He did not leave with any drama. He simply became less available than unavailable, than absent in the permanent way of someone who has closed a door from the other side and does not intend to open it again. She was left in the weeks after the divorce with a series of realizations that arrived in no particular order and were none of them welcome. She had left a marriage to a man who had been protecting her without her knowledge simply because she had misjudged the protection for limitation. She had aligned herself with a man who had wanted something from her family and had now moved on having not gotten it. She had spent months carefully building an image of herself as a woman ascending, using connections and credit that did not belong to her, and the people who had watched that performance had all done so with expressions she had misread as admiration. She was not ascending. She had never been ascending. She had been walking toward the edge of something and calling it progress. The community picnic in Bronzeville was held on a Saturday afternoon in late June, the kind of day the city offered as compensation for its winters, warm and unhurried, with folding tables set out on the grass, and children running through the spaces between them, and the smell of food from a dozen different grills, drifting together into something that smelled like summer itself. It was an annual event that the Brooks family had supported for years, and Layla's office organized, and which Khalil had attended without fail, since he was old enough to be brought along by his father. He stood near the food tables with a paper plate and talked to people he had known for 20 years, and he was at ease in a way that had nothing to do with the events of the past months, because this was his community. And it had always been his community, and nothing that had happened in a courtroom changed that. Zora arrived 40 minutes after the event started. Khalil saw her before she saw him, which gave him a moment to decide what his face was going to do, and he decided it was going to do very little, which was the truest expression available to him. She had dressed carefully, in the way of someone who understood they were about to walk into a situation they needed to manage, and she made her way through the crowd with the directional certainty of someone who has rehearsed an approach. When she found him, she stopped a few feet away and waited until he looked at her directly before she spoke. "I need to talk to you," Zora said. "Not to argue. I just need you to hear something." Khalil did not respond immediately. He set his plate down on the edge of the nearest table and gave her the same attention he gave to anything that required his full presence, which was complete and unhurried, and utterly without the anger she had perhaps been expecting and had perhaps been counting on to give her something to push against. "Then talk," he said. She had clearly prepared what she wanted to say, and it came out with the cadence of something rehearsed, without being rehearsed well enough to sound natural. Victor had misrepresented himself to her from the beginning. She had not understood what he was after until it was too late. She had evidence of things he had done, things that were relevant, things that might be useful to the family. She had not known about the trust, had not understood what she was walking into. When she talked to the lawyers, had not intended for things to go the way they went. Nia, who had been standing close enough to hear and had made no effort to move further away, looked at Zora with the expression of a woman who has been patient for a long time and has finally been released from the obligation. "Victor's already been handled," she said. "He hasn't had a real conversation with anyone in this industry in 4 months. Whatever you think you have on him, we don't need it." Zora looked at her and then at Khalil, and then past both of them to where Layla Harper was standing a short distance away, talking to a group of parents from the youth housing program. She had not expected to find Layla here, though she should have, because Layla was always here, had always been here in a way that Zora had spent years not fully seeing. Layla noticed the look and walked over without hurrying, and she did not come with warmth or with coldness, but with the direct, measured attention of someone who had already decided what needed to be said and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it. "Zora," Layla said, and the tone was neither unkind nor its opposite. Zora turned to her with something that might have been an appeal. "I know how this looks," she said. "I know what everyone thinks happened. But I was also used in this. I'm not the only one who did something wrong." Layla was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet before she said something that was going to be precise. "You weren't used," she said. "You made choices, each one. You knew what you were doing when you put your name on that housing fundraiser. You knew what you were doing when you listed yourself as a donor on work you didn't fund. Nobody put a pen in your hand." She paused. "You left everything you had before anyone took it from you. That's not something that happened to you. That's something you did." Zora opened her mouth and then did not say anything, because there was no available response to a sentence that accurate delivered by a person who had been watching long enough to be certain of every word. Khalil had not interrupted, and he did not interrupt now. He picked his plate back up from the table, and he looked at Zora for a long moment, and what was in his expression was not triumph, and it was not pity, and it was not anything that required her to respond to it. It was simply the look of a man who had arrived at the far side of something and found solid ground underfoot. "Take care of yourself," he said. It was not a dismissal. It was not warmth. It was a sentence that meant exactly what it said, and she would have to decide what to do with it on her own time. She left. Not dramatically, not with any of the scenes that the situation might have seemed to call for, but in the way people leave when they understand that the room is not going to give them what they came for, quietly, and in the direction of the parking lot. Khalil watched her go long enough to confirm she was going, And then he turned back to the table and the food and the neighborhood that had known his family for 40 years. And he rejoined the afternoon as though it had always been waiting for him to come back to it. Layla found him an hour later, near the east end of the park, where a group of teenagers from the youth program were deep in a conversation about something that made all of them laugh at the same time. She stood beside him and watched them for a moment without saying anything, because she had the same quality he did of knowing when silence was the right contribution to a moment. "You okay?" she asked finally. "Better than I thought I would be," he said, which was the truth. She nodded. She looked at the teenagers, at the way they moved with the loose-limbed ease of young people who felt safe where they were. "Reggie told me what you're thinking about doing with the Bronzeville parcels," she said. "Not thinking about it anymore," Khalil said. "Doing it." She looked at him then, with the directness she brought to everything. "Those families have been waiting a long time for someone to take those lots seriously." "I know," he said. "My father knew it too. He was putting money aside for it for years." He was quiet for a moment. "I think he was waiting for me to be ready." Layla did not say anything to that. She did not need to. She simply stood beside him in the late afternoon light and watched the teenagers, and Khalil stood beside her, and the decision that had been forming since the night he sat in his father's office with the folder open in front of him settled into something final and clear. He was not going to build a monument to what he had survived. He was not going to use the Brooks name or the Brooks trust or the Brooks land as an instrument of personal vindication. He was going to use it the way his father had always intended it to be used, as a foundation, literal and figurative, for the people who needed one and had been waiting for someone with the means and the will to provide it. The Bronzeville parcels had sat empty for 11 years. 11 years of broken glass and chain link, and the desolation of land in a city that has forgotten what it is supposed to do with itself. He had walked past them 100 times and felt his father's impatience in his own chest. The frustration of a builder who looks at empty land and sees only what it could be. The money had been waiting in the trust. The plans had been waiting in the folder. All that had been missing was the moment when everything aligned, and the moment he understood, standing in that park in the late June light, was now. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in early December, when the Chicago cold had come back in earnest. But the sky was the clear blue that made the city look like it had been rinsed overnight. Khalil Brooks stood on a temporary platform in the middle of what had been, until very recently, an empty lot on the south side of Bronzeville, and looked out at the largest crowd he had ever spoken to in his life. They were not there because of him, or not only because of him. They were there because the land behind him had been empty for 11 years, and the people who lived around it had been watching it sit empty and wondering for 11 years what it was going to take for someone to do something about it. And the answer had finally arrived in the form of a groundbreaking ceremony for a development called Langston Legacy Homes. The name had been Nia's suggestion, offered quietly over dinner 3 months earlier, and Khalil had accepted it without deliberation, because it was right. And he knew it was right the moment she said it. Langston for the street. Their father had grown up on 3 blocks east in a neighborhood that had since changed enough times to make the street almost unrecognizable, but not quite, because neighborhoods like this one held their history in the way old buildings held heat slowly and from the inside. Legacy, because that was the point. Not construction, not development, not any of the words the industry used to make building things sound like a financial instrument. Legacy, which was a word about time, about what you leave and who you leave it to. The platform had been built by his own crew, a detail Khalil had insisted on, with enough finality that no one had argued. Behind the platform, where a building's footprint had been staked out in orange flags against the frozen ground, a sign read, "Langston Legacy Homes, affordable housing for working families, a Brooks family development." Beside the platform, on a simple folding table, sat his father's leather folder. Not displayed, not treated as a relic. Just present the way it had always been present, because it belonged where Khalil was working, and this was where he was working now. Reggie spoke first briefly, and with the dry warmth of a man who had been making remarks at family occasions since before most of the audience was born. He thanked the alderman who had helped clear the permitting the community organization that had maintained the relationship with the city on the family's behalf for 3 years, while the planning moved forward, and the people of Bronzeville itself, which he described as the kind of neighborhood that made the work worth doing, because the work was for people worth doing it for. He did not mention Zora. He did not mention Victor. He did not mention the divorce or the trust, or any of the machinery that had brought them to this morning. He simply stood at the microphone with his hands clasped in front of him and spoke about Aldous Brooks in a voice that carried the register of a man talking about someone he had loved and lost. And several people in the audience who had known Khalil's father nodded in the way of people who are being reminded of something true. Nia spoke next. She was brief and precise as she always was, and she focused on the scholarship fund that would be announced in conjunction with the groundbreaking. The Brooks Future Scholarship, she explained, was an endowment of $2,300,000, established through the family trust directed specifically toward young people from Bronzeville and the surrounding neighborhoods who wanted to pursue careers in construction, civil engineering, architecture, or project management. It would fund not just tuition, but licensing fees, tools, certifications, the practical expenses that stood between a young person and a skilled trade, the same way a chain-link fence stood between a vacant lot and everything it could become. Applications would open in the new year. The first awards would be announced in the spring. There was a sound from the crowd, at the number a collective exhale that was almost a word, and Nia let it settle before she continued. The scholarship, she said, was named for the kind of work that built cities and fed families and made possible every structure that human beings had ever passed through, work that some people called skilled labor and others called blue-collar, and her family called the foundation of everything. She did not say what Zora had called it. She did not need to. There were people in the audience who knew and people who would find out, and the work itself was a more complete answer than any sentence she could have offered. Khalil came to the microphone last. He had not written remarks because he did not write remarks for things he actually needed to say. He stood at the microphone with the cold coming off the frozen ground, and the crowd in front of him, and the orange flags behind him, and he looked out at the people, at the older residents who had watched this lot sit empty for 11 years, at the young people from the workforce, programs, at the men and women he had worked alongside on job sites across the city who had shown up on a Saturday morning because he had called and they had come. My father used to say, Khalil began, that a building is just material until someone decides what it's for. He said that about houses and offices and schools and every structure he ever worked on. And I think he was right, but I think he meant it about more than buildings. He paused. He meant it about families. He meant it about communities. He meant it about the things people build with their time and their work and their trust. Any of it is just material until you decide what it's for. He looked out at the crowd, and the silence that followed was not for effect. It was simply him taking a breath before the next thing, and the crowd understood the difference. 11 years ago, this lot was rezoned and cleared and then left. My father was trying to get it developed for the last 4 years of his life. After he passed, I kept trying. A lot of you helped. Layla Harper's office kept the relationships alive when the city wasn't moving. Reggie kept the financing structured so we could tow the moment the permits cleared. A lot of people did a lot of work that didn't have their names on it, because that's how most of the work that matters gets done. He reached back and picked up the leather folder from the table without ceremony and held it at his side. This has my father's original plans for this development in it. He drew the first version on a legal pad in this neighborhood in 1989. It's gone through 40 revisions since then. He didn't live to see the first revision become this. He looked at the folder. But the thing about a plan is that it doesn't stop being a plan when the person who made it is gone. It's still a plan. Someone still has to build it. He set the folder back on the table. He looked out at the crowd. And then, without preamble, without announcement, Nia stepped to the secondary speaker, set up at the side of the platform, and pressed play. She and Khalil had spoken the night before about this moment, and he had nodded once, and that had been the whole of the conversation, because between them it did not require more. The sound came out of the speakers, clearly the way sounds do, when a space goes quiet enough that even an imperfect recording carries. It was a voice that some people in the audience recognized immediately, and some recognized after a few seconds, and some needed longer. Zora's voice, unhurried and unguarded, speaking to someone who was not in this crowd in a restaurant 8 months ago. The Brooks family is a construction company. That's all they are. They pour concrete and frame walls, and they think that makes them something. Khalil has never had an original thought in his life. He just executes what his father told him to do 30 years ago. You want to know what their big legacy project is going to be? More housing for people who can't afford anything better. That's their vision. That's their ceiling. I spent 12 years in that family, and I'm telling you, they don't have the imagination for anything bigger than the last thing they built. The recording was 40 seconds long. When it ended, the space it left was not silence exactly. It was something denser than silence, the atmospheric weight of a crowd that has heard something that makes them very still. Khalil had not played it to humiliate anyone. He had not set it up with framing or build-up. Nia had made the call about when and what she had decided simply and without drama was that the community whose imagination Zora had dismissed was standing here in the cold on a Saturday morning, waiting to see the foundation poured on a project that had been 30 years in the making, and they deserved to hear what had been said about them. Zora was in the crowd. She had come, and Khalil had known she would come because Zora had always understood the importance of being present at moments that mattered, and this was a moment that mattered whether she wanted it to or not. He did not look for her after the recording played. He did not need to see her face to know what was on it. He stepped back to the microphone. The families on the housing wait list for Bronzeville have been waiting an average of 4 years. He said, the same steady voice as before, as though the recording had been a weather event that had passed through and the work was still the work. We're going to start reducing that wait, starting with the first phase of this project. The goal is to have 36 units occupied by this time next year and 60 by the following December. He paused. We build to schedule in this family. And then after a beat, he said the last line the way a man says the thing he has been carrying for a long time and is finally ready to set down in front of everyone. The Brooks family doesn't walk home. We build homes for other people to walk into. There was a sound from the crowd that became applause before it reached its full shape, and Khalil let it rise and did not try to speak over it. He had one more thing to say, and he was going to say it when the room was ready to hear it. When the applause settled, he returned to the microphone. I also want to announce that the Community Development Fund that has supported programming in this neighborhood for the past 6 years is being restructured. Going forward, all fund administration, grant distribution, and community liaison work will be conducted officially by Layla Harper's office. He gestured toward where Layla was standing at the edge of the platform. She's been doing the work for years. The name on the letterhead is finally going to match the person doing the work. Layla stepped forward and nodded to the crowd with the composed, contained acknowledgement of someone who receives public recognition with the understanding that recognition is a tool and tools should be used for things worth doing. The applause this time was longer. There were people in the crowd who had worked with Layla, who had received grants from the fund under her coordination, who had been wondering for years, whose name was actually attached to the decisions that had shaped their programming. They were not applauding a transfer of administration. They were applauding a correction. Khalil stepped back from the microphone. He reached for the old case, again held it, and then said the last thing almost quietly, not performing it, just saying it. My father believed that the point of building something was not to have it. He said it was to make sure it outlasted you. He looked at the orange flags in the frozen ground behind him, at the stakes marking the foundation that would go in on Monday. This outlasts both of us. That's the point. He stepped back from the platform. The first shovel went into the ground. A few minutes later, Khalil and Reggie and Naya and Layla in a row, with ceremonial shovels, and the crowd pressed closer to watch, And behind them, the city went about its Saturday, with no particular awareness that something significant had just been decided in a vacant lot in Bronzeville. Khalil did not look for Zora in the crowd during any of it. Afterward, someone told him she had left before the shovels went into the ground, which seemed right to him. He had not played the recording to make her stay. He had not given the scholarship to make her regret. He had not restored Layla's name on the letterhead to humiliate anyone. He had done all of it because it was what needed doing, which was he had learned over a long life of building things, the only reason that held up over time. He was still holding the leather folder when the ceremony ended, and the crowd began to break apart into smaller conversations, and the cold came back in the way it always came back when people stopped moving. He tucked it under his arm, the way he always had, the way he had every morning for 12 years, and he walked back toward the street with Nia on one side and Layla on the other, and the city spread out in front of them in the bright December light, full of things that needed building, and he was, for the first time in a long time, entirely ready to build them. Zora Brooks left the groundbreaking ceremony before the shovels went into the ground, which was perhaps the most accurate description of her relationship to the Brooks family's work that anyone could have offered. She had always left before the foundation was poured. She had always been more interested in the announcement than the building, more comfortable with the image of a thing than the slow, unglamorous work of making it real. She walked back to her car in the December cold without speaking to anyone, and no one in the crowd moved to stop her or to speak to her, not because they were unkind, but because there was nothing left to say that the morning had not already said more completely than any of them could have managed. The recording spread the way things spread in a community that communicates mostly in person through the people who had been there, and the people who had not been there and asked what they had missed and were told accurately and without embellishment what had happened. Zora did not try to contest it, because there was nothing to contest. It was her voice and her words, and a sentiment she had expressed without hesitation in what she had believed was a private moment, which was, as most people eventually discover, the most honest version of a person there is. The professional consequences arrived on their own schedule. The boards she had served on began to find reasons to restructure. The committee roles she had accumulated over several years of strategic attendance at the right events were redistributed to people who had been doing the underlying work without the recognition. The invitations thinned, and then thinned further, and then stopped arriving in the way that makes a person understand they have not been forgotten, but reclassified. And separately, quietly, the legal process that Khalil had set in motion through the family's attorneys moved forward on the forged signatures, the matter proceeding through the proper channels in the proper time without anyone needing to announce it. She was not destroyed in the dramatic sense. She was returned to the size she had actually been before she borrowed what was not hers to borrow, and the law was doing its own accounting alongside that. Victor Langford was already gone from her life by the time the groundbreaking happened, and the manner of his going had been even less satisfying than she had expected, which was that there was no manner to speak of. He had not confronted her or explained himself or given her anything she could construct a narrative around. He had simply become unavailable and then absent, a man-shaped absence where a man had been, and she had been left to understand in her own time that she had been useful to him in the way that tools are useful, and that tools are set down when the job is over, without any ceremony or acknowledgement of what the tool had contributed. She had believed she was making a choice when she left Khalil. She understood now that Victor had made the choice for her in the way that a trap makes a choice for the thing that walks into it. The 36 units of Langston Legacy homes were occupied 14 months after the groundbreaking, 2 months ahead of schedule, because Khalil Brooks built to schedule and occasionally ahead of it. The second phase broke ground the following spring. The Brooks Future Scholarship awarded its first 4 recipients in March, young people from Bronzeville and the adjacent neighborhoods, 3 of them, the first in their families, to pursue a licensed trade. One of them, a young woman who had been working as an unpaid apprentice for 2 years because she could not afford the certification fees. Naya announced the recipients at a small ceremony in the community center 3 blocks from where the first phase was being occupied, and the 4 of them stood at the front of the room with the contained pride of people who have not yet learned to perform pride for an audience, which made it more moving than any performance could have been. Khalil and Layla did not make an announcement about what they were to each other, because neither of them was the kind of person who made announcements about things that were still in the process of becoming. They worked together, and they had dinner, and they walked through job sites on Saturday mornings, and they had long conversations that began in professional territory and moved elsewhere in the way of conversations between people who are trying to understand each other and finding with some surprise that the understanding comes easily. Reggie noticed and said nothing, because Reggie had known for some time and had chosen with characteristic precision to express his approval by simply not saying anything at all. Nia noticed and said something, but only once, and what she said was accurate enough that Khalil did not bother to respond to it, which she correctly interpreted as confirmation. The leather folder sits on Khalil's desk now in the office he uses for the development company, in a building he owns in Bronzeville, 3 blocks from where his father grew up. The original plans his father drew in 1989 are still inside it now, filed behind the plans for Langston Legacy Homes and the Brooks Future Scholarship documentation, and the agreements for the next 3 parcels the family has committed to developing over the following decade. It is not a museum piece. It is a working document. His father built it to be used, and he uses it, and when the work is finished for the day, he closes it and puts it in the same place and comes back to it the next morning, the way you return to anything that still has work left in it. Here is the thing worth carrying out of this story, and it is not about divorce or betrayal or family trusts, though it is made from all of those things. Real power was never the ability to destroy the person who wronged you, though that ability was available to Khalil Brooks, and he chose not to spend it that way. Real power is the patience to build something that outlasts your anger, the discipline to let the law do what law does, while you spend your own resources on something that will still be standing when the anger is gone. And real leadership was never the loudest voice in the room, never the person who took up the most space or claimed the most credit or made sure everyone knew what they had survived. It was the person who looked at a vacant lot and a worn leather folder full of plans and a community that had been waiting 11 years and said, "I know what this is for. Let me build it." If this story gave you something, leave a comment and tell me what part of it stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that patience and purpose are not the same thing as surrender, and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting, and it belongs to someone just like Khalil, someone who stayed quiet long enough to build something that could not be taken.